wisdom, cherished memories, life lessons, family heritage. The golden memories gained through your dreams and achievements are a treasure chest filled with the wisdom of the ages. This is your life legacy to be cherished for generations to come. This is the life story of Barry Nemcoff, a veteran broadcaster, devoted teacher, and world traveler who's gained a lifetime of experiences to share with his family and the world.
I'm doing this as a legacy for my children and grandchildren. And even now I have a great-grandson. So that once in a while, when I'm no longer around to talk to them directly, they'll be able to look at this tape, hopefully, and get a sense of where they came from, what their family background is. My life story started in 1925 in Tientsin, China, North China. And the reason I was born there is because my father was a businessman there. He was an engineer who built railroads. And he met my mother, who was a young girl, a refugee from the Russian Revolution. They married, and I was the sole offspring. Tientsin is a city that had a lot of foreigners, fairly large foreign population. There were Americans there, there were Europeans there, and for all intents and purposes, it was a European environment that I grew up in. Of course, it was in China, but we had all the amenities. We had movies, I read American comics, and I went to a Catholic school called St. Louis College, and it was run by the Marist brothers, and it ran from first grade through graduation, 12th grade. In growing up in China, I had an ama. An ama is a nurse, a nanny. And she was with me, believe it or not, till I was 11 years old. I never tied my own shoes until I was 11 years old. And she became very much a member of the family. And when we left China at the age of 13, we had to leave behind our household staff, and it was like leaving family behind. And we left, of course, when the Japanese invaded China in 1937. My father's business was no longer a viable thing for him, so we came to the United States. When we came to the United States, we came to Philadelphia, where my father had relatives. And we settled in Philadelphia. And my dad had lost all of his money, so we came literally with the shirts on our backs. And we settled in a pretty rough part of Philadelphia, and I went to school in Philadelphia. I was right at the high school age. Well, what amazed me was what high school was in the United States compared with what high school was in China. I mean, I thought it was a country club. You know, I couldn't believe that this was school.
After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Barry couldn't wait to graduate in 1942 so he could enlist in the Navy.
My boot camp training, instead of being 9 weeks or 12 weeks, was 3 weeks, and I was assigned for duty on a little minesweeper that operated in the American theater and in the Atlantic, which was an experience. It was a small ship, rough seas, tough duty, but as kids, believe it or not, We loved it. You know, strange. It takes kids to win a war, or fight a war, I should say. It was during my last few months in the Navy in December 1945 that I met a beautiful girl from Virginia. She was 18, I was 20, and we were married. And after I was discharged, within about 10 months, we had a lovely son named Barry. And of course, I had to go to work. I was out of the service, and it was important for me to earn a living, both for her and for the baby. And I really didn't know what to do with myself. I did everything. I drove cabs, I loaded trucks, fruit trucks, I sold corn on the cob in corn country to farmers who had just left their dinner table eating corn, to show you how smart I was as a business person. And finally, I was driving a cab in Philadelphia, and I was passing Temple University. And I stopped the cab for a red light right across the street from where the registrar's office was. I said, I'm going to go in and find out about going to school. So I walk in. Of course, I'm wearing the little black cap, little leather bow tie, and a white shirt, sleeves rolled down, very proper, yellow cab. And the woman at the desk says, anybody call a taxi? And I says, wait a minute, lady. I didn't come in here to pick up a fare. I came in to find out about going to school on a GI Bill. She says, well, I have to ask you, what do you want to study? And suddenly I was stumped. I had not thought about that little item. And I had to come up with an answer. And fortunately, I remembered this guy who was on the ship with me during the war. His name was Oscar Glantz, and he used to tell me, when the war's over, I'm going to become a journalist. I wasn't sure what he wanted to become, but there was my answer. And I said to her, I want to study journalist. She says, you mean you want to study journalism? I said, yeah, that's it, journalism. While working at the CBS station, I met and married my second wife, Betty, another lovely girl, and we had 2 children in due time. Paul was a son, and 4 years later came Nina. The time now is 1959, and I was fortunate enough to be awarded a fellowship, a CBS fellowship for a year of study at Columbia. And there were 8 of us who were chosen to do this. Charles Kuralt was one of them, Marvin Kalb was one of them, John Tiffin, who was still executive producer in London for 60 Minutes, was one of them. So I was in good company. It was a wonderful year at Columbia, at the end of which I was given a job at CBS News in New York. This was the big time. This was the big leagues. Well, the big leagues for me was producing the morning news. At that time, nothing like the morning news today. 15 minutes. The only people working on the morning news, I was a producer, there was a film editor, and there was a director, and Richard C. Hodelet was the anchor.
But the words of President John F. Kennedy profoundly affected the news producer and sparked yet another turning point in Barry's life.
My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man.
Well, I picked up on that message, and it changed the course of my life. I went to work for the United States Information Agency because Kennedy had appointed Edward R. Murrow as its director. And of course, he was the big journalist at that time, and there were 4 of us at CBS who followed him.
Working with the renowned journalist Edward R. Murrow wasn't the only big event for Barry. His first overseas assignment took him to Bangladesh for 2 years.
It might have been the other side of the moon as far as I was concerned. It was very, very different. Even though I had been born and grew up in Asia, it was nothing like I had experienced in China. But I enjoyed the 2 years there. And I did a lot of adventuring of my own in addition to my job. And one of them was taking a package to a priest up on the Indian border in Assam. And what is it that I'm bringing there? I'm bringing a crossbow that they had ordered from Sears. The reason Father Marks ordered a crossbow is because the government had confiscated his shotgun. He had fired it to try to shoot a leopard that was preying on the flocks of villagers there, and the shot set off a border incident between the Pakistanis and Indians, and they had a big investigation and they confiscated his shotgun. Anyhow, I bring him this crossbow, and they insist that I stay there and stay with them for a couple of days, and they're going to feed me. Well, I had brought canned goods with me. They insisted on feeding me. So when I was leaving, I said, look, I've got all these canned goods. I'm sure you can use them. Please take them. And I said, here's a bottle of whiskey, Johnny Walker, that I was carrying with me. And I said, you can have the whiskey too. They were very thankful. And then there's Father Marks is standing there, and he looks like he's just kind of embarrassed. He wants to say something. And I said, what is it, Father? What's on your mind? And he says, I saw something in your sleeping bag when you unpacked it, and I wondered if we could have it. I said, anything, you can have anything. I said, what is it? He said, we saw you were carrying a roll of toilet paper. We haven't had any in 7 years. So I was glad to give them some toilet paper, keeping just enough for me to make it on the way back for 2 days through the jungle.
Sharing and giving are important lessons that filled Barry's life with rich experiences.
Well, I had some very wonderful times in Bangladesh, then East Pakistan. I made some very nice friends with the local people. As a matter of fact, I got invited to their homes, and in one instance, they even dressed me up to look like a grandee. And I sent these pictures that you see, I sent them home saying, we'll be coming home soon, without signing the name, to all my friends, which created a little bit of a stir because they couldn't quite tell who it was dressed up in all that native costume. From East Pakistan, I was transferred to Japan. Quite a difference. And I spent actually close to 5 years in Japan. The first 2 years in language school, full-time language study, 9 to 5, studying Japanese, which was an ordeal, unbelievable ordeal. The other ordeal was the breakup of my second marriage in Japan. And Betty and the children went to the States, and it was a very tough time for me to see them off at the airport. Life goes on, and it went on for me. Eventually, I met my third wife, Keiko, and one of the strong points of our relationship was sailing. I loved to sail boats, and she became a great sailor with me. And we did a lot of sailing around Japan, had wonderful adventures, met a lot of interesting Japanese people through sailing, and then came the Vietnam War, of course, and I was working in Japan at a time when Japan was a focal point for journalists going to Vietnam. They would stop, we would have to talk to them about the war and all of that.
As the press attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo, Barry also encountered many high-ranking government officials.
It was the night of the Christmas Embassy Christmas Ball. And that was the night that Hubert Humphrey, then Vice President, decided he was coming to Japan. And I'm dressed up in my tux. My sweetheart Keiko is in her Japanese kimono, and we were assigned to meet Vice President Humphrey at the airport. Well, it's pouring rain. Well, I can tell you what happened to our costumes, okay? And I can tell you what my opinion of Hubert Humphrey was after that. It took a while for me to start liking him again.
While serving the government for 7 years, CBS was also serving Barry by continuing his employment benefits.
I wasn't being paid, but my retirement years went on because this was all part of having asked Uncle Sam what I can do for you rather than the other way around. And at this point, they offered me a job in Philadelphia, and I snapped it up because, number one, my children were there by my previous marriage. I wanted to get back to family, and I wanted to get back to news. I'd had enough of government service for a while. So I went back to Philadelphia, this time as news director at the CBS owned and operated station, Channel 10 in Philadelphia. It was while I was with a CBS station in Philadelphia that Keiko and I got married. That was in 1967. And we had a wonderful boy named Mark. So now I have, if you count, I've got 4 children. Barry by my first marriage, Nina and Paul by my second marriage, and Mark by my third marriage. And I might add at this point, I have wonderful relations with all of them. They have wonderful relations with each other, and I have wonderful relations with all of my ex-wives. This was a very interesting time. We're talking about 1967 to 1972. If you recall, all sorts of things were happening. There were urban riots, the Vietnam War resistance movement. Crime was starting to get even worse than it had been. So having come back to doing urban news in the United States was quite an experience. And I learned a lot of lessons about the power of television.
Determined to harness that power to serve the public, Barry and 3 CBS colleagues formed a freelance film production company called Telegroup.
We were going to do some very significant documentaries, socially significant documentaries at a time when there were a lot of subjects to be covered. Well, let me tell you, we ended up doing commercials for plumbers and things of that sort. And the plus side of this was having our own business. We could shut the doors and say, go on fishing. And that's what we used to do. The 3 of us used to take off during a week and say, what the heck, we're not making money, we might as well go fishing. And we went fishing.
Telegroup didn't spend all its time fishing. They managed to make some interesting documentaries as well.
We went out and we did a documentary on Norman Rockwell illustrating the poetry of Robert Frost on the centennial of his birth. And it was a wonderful experience, filming Rockwell, of course, and going to all the places that were illustrative of Frost's poems. So that was one of the high points. I might add that this documentary ran for 9 weeks, which was a record. It was a short subject at Radio City Music Hall in New York. And to this date, it has a run of 9 weeks as an established record for a short subject. Well, the freelance venture didn't bring in enough money, and we didn't catch enough big fish. So I relented and started looking for a job, and was fortunate enough to land a job with ABC News as senior producer for news on Good Morning America. From New York and Good Morning America, I was transferred to Chicago to become bureau chief for the Chicago Bureau at the time that Max Robinson, if you recall, was transferred to Chicago to become the 3rd national anchor for ABC News out of Chicago. And that was the reason for my transfer, to handle that situation. Well, I was, of course, hankering to get back to Philadelphia. That's where my roots were, and I wanted to get back there in the worst way. So, again, on the move. Temple University, my alma mater, offers me a job as assistant dean in their School of Journalism. And I accepted, just like that. And it was fine, but again, it wasn't me. The restlessness set in, and I was offered another job, this time back in New York, producing a program called Japan Today. It was a weekly magazine program dealing with what was going on in Japan. And it was while I was with Japan Today that I happened on an assignment actually to Japan to meet the general manager and president of the PBS station in Miami. And we were having breakfast on a Wednesday morning, and it was raining. And he says, darn it, why did it have to rain today? I said, what's wrong, George? He says, I was looking forward to going out and taking pictures of that beautiful garden out there outside the hotel, and it had to rain. I didn't know what to say. I had to reply, say something. I said, well, you people in Florida have no reason to complain about the weather. He says, why, you like Florida? I said, no, I love to sail, and I've never lived anywhere where I could sail the year round. End of conversation. That's May. In October, I get a call from Miami we've got an opening, managing editor for the Nightly Business Report. Are you interested in being interviewed? I said, sure. And I go to work for the Nightly Business Report as managing editor and later became executive producer. And I spent 10 years there, 10 wonderful years doing business news, which was telecast 5 nights a week, Monday through Friday, carried by nearly 300 stations all over the United States. And I was in Florida, and I was sailing, and Kay was sailing with me, and it turned out to be a great experience. The one experience that didn't turn out to be a very good one was Hurricane Andrew. We sought shelter in an area we thought wasn't going to be hit directly. As it turned out, it was hit directly. The house around us was blown away. The house next door was blown away. The house across the street was blown away. And my sailboat sunk in the storm. As the house is blowing away around us, there are 6 of us in this little bathroom, 3 large dogs, a kitten, and a small dog. And we're sitting there, and water is pouring down through the light fixture. And my wife, Keiko, is looking at all of us. She puts her hand in her pocketbook and she brings out a camera. And she starts taking pictures of us. And I suddenly saw the humor in this situation. And I said, you can't go anywhere without finding a Japanese tourist with a camera. And of course it broke up the whole place and brought a little levity to a situation that was pretty serious.
While continuing his job in public television, Barry taught journalism at Florida International University in Miami to gain fresh insight through the eyes of his students.
I loved working with young people because you sort of get into a rut in doing things the way you've always done it. And the young people would kind of wake you up and say, why do you do it that way? And suddenly I would have to ask myself, well, why did I do it that way? Became a creature of habit. And they kind of stirred my life up intellectually, and that was fine. After retirement, I continued to teach full-time at FIU. They wanted me to stay there longer, but I felt that I wanted the freedom to move around. When you're teaching, you have an obligation to students. You can't willy-nilly pick up and go. Well, as it turned out, I couldn't willy-nilly go anyhow because my poor wife, Keiko, was diagnosed with a terminal illness. She passed on in 1997. Here I sit now, a bachelor again, with plenty of time on my hands, and I indulge myself by reading and doing some woodwork. I love doing woodwork. I always had a wood shop when I lived in a house. In an apartment, I have a little closet. And what I do is build clocks. That's my favorite. I build clocks for all the members of my family, and no 2 designs are the same. So I've become Barry the clockmaker. I try to sail whenever I can. I see friends, and most importantly, since this is the internet age, I stay in touch with my kin, with all the kids on the internet. We email each other almost every day, and that's sort of kept all the connections alive. And I get up to Philadelphia to see them. Mark, my son Mark, is in California, and I get out there to see him once in a while. So I stay in touch, and where I'm going to be next year, I don't know. Somehow, through all this, I've managed to stay in touch, close touch, I might add, with family, with grandchildren, with children, former wives, all friendly. I see them as often as I can. They come and visit me. We have a wonderful time. We go fishing, we go sailing, we do all of the things that we love to do. And that to me is the importance of life, is to stay in touch with your kin, with your friends, with your children, with your relatives, and all of the things that have made life worthwhile.